Well, good morning, champions, fellow flat-belly travelers and coffee chat people. Saturday morning here. I think it's the 30th of June. And I had to do this film outside because it's just so gorgeous. You see me squinting here, it's because the sun is just coming up and it's getting in my eyes a little bit, but it's just so beautiful here this morning. Maybe I'll do a panorama later on of the landscape. I used the word champion because at our last coffee chat, we talked about this idea of us, each and every one of us human beings, being champion in nature. This idea, once again, for lack of a better term, I've kind of ripped off from a guy named John Delemy. He's a public speaker type of guy in the States, and he's got a really interesting life story in that when he was born, the doctors and so on told him that he wouldn't speak ever properly because he had a speech impediment, and now he says you can't shut him up. Somebody believed in him. He believed in himself at a certain point, for sure. And if you want to see some of his work, it's John, regular spelling, John, and it's an Italian name. I think it's D-I, separate word, and then L-E-M-M-E, I think. Something like that. And just type in John Delemy champion. You'll get some of the videos that he's done like that. Now, I just thought I'd start off with an interesting idea, bringing it really back to basics, in terms of us being here on this earth as being something amazing itself. And if you're somebody who likes odds, at least for the fun of it once in a while, and you think about it for a moment, the odds of us being here in this incarnation as human beings walking and talking on the face of this earth is really quite amazing if you think about it. Because obviously two people had to get together, generally speaking. There's not too many test tube specimens walking around us, are there? Two people had to get together, and in some cases, I know my parents' case, they're from two different cultures. They got together somehow. And not only that, once they were together, they got together on a certain occasion, an occasion of passion, probably. I'm sure it must have been. And then, of course, at that moment, there had to be an egg, a reproductive egg, which was ripe for the time. And then there were, some people estimate, between 200 and 300 million sperm cells, all going for the opportunity to be one, you might say, with this egg. And depending on which one got there, the characteristics of the human being would be somewhat different based on genetics as we know it and whatnot, right? And all of this happened, this whole interaction, except for the two getting together. I mean, the machinery of it all, the mechanism of it all, the intelligence of it all, the sperm and the reproductive system and all that sort of thing, all that sort of goings on, went on without our parents' active conscious knowledge. It was just kind of happening, right? So we can say the intelligence, okay, in a moment of passion, sometimes anyways, the human experience is not one of great intellectual intelligence. It's kind of going with the nature of things, right? But for that intricacy to take place, for all those cells to swim in a maddening crowd, to be going in a certain way, to me would indicate intelligence, and intelligence beyond our capacity in many ways to, it seems anyways, to be able to be almost comprehensible. Now, and therefore, in saying that there's all this intelligence that there must be going on, we can say that there must be more to it than just odds. But odds, it's kind of fun once in a while. We play games and whatnot. So let's run with odds for a while. Why not, eh? Let's look at a few other things. Okay, as was mentioned above, we survived these odds. We came through. Or not only survived, it was us, the peculiar one, the individual, which could have been one of several hundred million we talked about that came through, but it was us who came through. And then we survived the gestation period. which is probably not as great of odds, but nevertheless, or lesser odds that we wouldn't have made it. But nevertheless, there's risks involved. You talk to anybody who's in this field, they'll say that there are risks involved in that as well. We survived the birthing process, which today is not as critical, not as chancy, but nevertheless, there are risks involved there as well. We survived childhood. I don't know about you, but there's been times when I was a kid, a toddler, that I would try to pull, boiling pots of what Mom was cooking off the stove, and she would just last minute grab me and haul me away. And I remember falling down the stairs, or at least being told about it, all the way down the stairs, and landing on the top of on my head at the bottom. I was probably about 4 years old. Survived. We all survived our teenage years and young adult years, where in some of our cases, entertainment involved certain forms of drinking, sport, binges, whatever it was, car races, things like this, all to impress the other boys and girls who were sometimes at certain parties doing things equally as ridiculous and as idiotic. But nevertheless, we survived. So you can say in that way, we are champions. We're survivors. And sometimes I think it's valuable for us to think about that, to consider that, to meditate on it, about how precious this life is and how we've come through it. And in doing so, and being so grateful for that, for all those experiences and having survived, it kind of displaces all the other things which we might consider as troubles in our lives or problems with us when we have this precious experience called life, wouldn't you say? And because at the same time, we know that in our past, at least speaking for myself, I've many times spent many times worrying about problems, thinking about the past, what was back there, and concocting it in some way and projecting it into the future, which is another concocted idea, and not being present to the moment of being alive. So I think with recognizing how precious it is and the championship of us being alive can help us to get off of that habit of distracting ourselves with worries and the idea that there's something wrong with us. And we can do this because when we realize that we can stop for a moment and look at things the other way as the championship of ourselves, we realize that also things like fear and confusion of the future and the past and all those sorts of things are just one way we can be. They are equally as they're a possibility in us as equal as any other. And there are many other ways that we can be. So it comes down to our decision as to what we want to experience. But of course, if we spent many, many years being a certain way, being wrapped up in fear and so on, based on, as John DeLevy talks about, what are dysfunctional families. He uses the term, he said in Italian, family means dysfunctional. That was kind of funny. He's an Italian guy, but I think that's the case with any family, really. We all have our dysfunctionalities in a way if we want to look at it that way. But the other way to look at it is it was all a growing experience. It was all trials and tribulations to help us now be grateful that we did survive it. And therefore, go forward with the idea of possibility. That hanging on to the fear and all this sort of thing is a possibility. We can also move forward in a direction that we want. Challenges, yes. Possible for sure as well. And practicing this reminds us of our naturalness to create habits and to be in the habit of going the direction we want to go, and therefore ignoring all those things that are so-called wrong with us. And we can then see all those things, so-called wrongs with us, in a different light, as an exercise. Just like I went for a little run down the road today. That's an exercise in strengthening myself in a way. Well, all those other things we can see when they come across us as an exercise to, oh, here's an opportunity to look on the bright side. That darkness is an opportunity to look on the bright side. Just like this morning, a bright side. Now, I forgot to bring the book out here, but there's a really good book I ran across recently. Wayne Dyer talks about it. It's called The Tao Te Ching, written by a guy named Lao Tzu, 2,600 years ago. It's astounding that some of these books are written. And in a way, if you think about it, what he wrote is probably almost more important than many of our modern inventions, because it's so profound. He talks about how the Tao, and the Tao means the way, I believe. It roughly translated. It's hard to translate those old terminologies, but the way, capital way. But the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao he talks about. The name, small n, that can be named is not the eternal name, capital N name. And what he's talking about, if you think about it between the lines, because he goes on to say that the naming is to particularize things. Which, I'm not saying that that's anything wrong with that. But yet, what he's saying in that, I think in that line, is between the lines, you might say when you read it in a certain way, that it's our nature as human beings and our individual experience to identify things. Naturally. How am I going to identify you if we're talking side by side without referring to you as a certain name and you referring to me as Steve? Because there's 10 people here and you say, hey buddy, as they say in Newfoundland, hey buddy, it might be in every one of us. I say, hey Steve, now you're talking to me, right? So that's natural. But that's not the eternal me. And when I say to talk to you and give your name, I'm not talking about the eternal you or what's more possible in you. It's just a particular name which identifies you in that moment. But I know I didn't transition very well, but I'm going into something a little bit different here because I wanted to talk about how when we were born, because we were talking about born, okay, there is the connection. When we were born, our parents, generally as a result of government legislation, filled out a form. And this was a form to basically identify us and register the event with some sort of government agency. And there was a form called, in Canada here, and in the province that I was born in Canada, which is Ontario, it was called a record of birth. And it basically said all the particular information, name, baby's birth date, mother's name, father's name, their address, the weight of the baby, birth date, signature at the bottom, this sort of thing. And here in Canada anyways, I can get that form. I can send away for it, and about $35 I get a photostatic certified copy. And I'll just show you mine here. I got it fairly recently. I won't be able to see it very well. I laminated it. But it's called a record of birth. And it's all written out back in the 60s when I was born in my mother's handwriting. It was very, very profound to get that. And anyways, this begins what Lao Tzu is talking about, is about naming it. So the name that's on there is not me. And what was really interesting, when I got this, it was very profound because I looked at it for quite a while for a number of reasons. It was history. It was my mom's handwriting. Years ago, my mom was 30-something years old. But what's interesting is that there's a birth date on there, November 14th, I think it was, if I can remember my birthday correctly. And then there's a registration date, or the date that my mom actually filled out the form, which was 2 weeks later. That's interesting. Normally I wouldn't have looked at that, but because I was doing something like this, and because I was doing something like this, I realized that I existed for 2 weeks without officially being named and recognized as having a name, because it was middle of November till early December when this was sent in. So even though Mom and Dad might have called me a name, officially I was unnamed. Yet I existed. So what came first? Often when somebody asks us, who are you? We say, I am Steve Maloney. Would it be more correct to say my name is? Because I am actually more than that. I existed before that did. Might be something interesting, eh? Another thing that's interesting about this, that's one thing that's interesting about it. Another thing that's interesting about it is that it's the only form of official document about us individually, that recognizes us as being alive, as human beings. For one thing, I know you can't see it very well, but on here it refers to child's name. A child is a human being. Well, that's pretty obvious, right? And it's a living child because it asks here how many children were born alive to this mother, including this child. So it refers to this child born alive. And the other thing about this is all other official documents that we have in society are created from this document, because this is the very first document. This is the foundational document. All other documents, I went through this before and showed you a few things like birth certificates, passports. They are all created from this originally. So this is the foundational document. Interesting thing. So that's really, if none of those others are good at some point, well, that's no good. So it's an interesting thing to have, really. If it's the most important one, it's an interesting one to have, perhaps. Now, where was I here? I'm reading through my things so I don't miss anything. Now, what was interesting in receiving this document, getting this document, you might, if you decide to get it, it might be something of interest, but and I'll get into why later, why it was really important to me at this point. What I found was in receiving this, I had to call a government agency, and I was told several falsehoods, which were quite interesting, actually. One thing I was told was that it's the same thing as a birth certificate, and that I didn't need it if I had a birth certificate. And a birth certificate is this little document here. It can come in a small card one, or it can come in a bigger one. But I was told it was the same thing, even though, and they even call it that in their application form. They call it a birth certificate. But yet, nowhere when I look on this does it say birth certificate. Nowhere. It does not say birth certificate. Whereas this one, you can't really see it very well, it says right on the top of it, Province of Ontario, Canada, birth certificate. The other thing on this one here is it's signed by a deputy and a registrar general, and at the very bottom it says it's made by the Canadian Banknote Corporation Company, Canadian Banknote Company Limited. That was kind of strange. This one here was signed by my mother, and it's signed by also some bureaucrat in the division of the registrar general. But it's not produced by anybody. If it's signed by my mom, in a way, as the first signer, she's the one who really produced it. She's the one who authorized the production of it, not a banknote corporation. So it's kind of strange that they would say it's actually the same thing, when it's not at all. And in fact, the information on here is different. The name is different on here. It's written different. It's only called name, whereas on here it's given names and surname. And there's very little on there. There's a birth date. There's and the numbers. There's a registration number on here, on the top of here, and and several numbers on here, and none of the numbers match up. So if it's the same document, why would they have different numbers? That's kind of strange to me. So they're not the same. That's one of the falsehoods. And the other falsehood, of course, is I'm told that I don't need it. So I started wondering, why is it that they don't want us to have this? And I don't think that the people I'm talking to on the phone really are aware of this. I think they're honestly going off a script. Somebody knows deep down that if we, as human beings, recognize that this document shows us to be human beings first, because we show up as live, indicated as live, before there was even a name registered. If we realize that, and probably not many people think about this, but people like myself, but maybe there's somebody there, then they might realize that we might actually express the desire for our inherent human rights at some point, which is to be free of all shackles, of all forms of slavery, which there are many still. Most of them are self-imposed because we end up using documents like this, which have no indication whatsoever that we are alive. It's simply a recognition of a name. That's all it is. Not much more than that. And where was I? I lost a little bit of control here. There was something else I wanted to say about Lao Tzu, which once again I don't have the book with me, but he talks about, if you want to go to page 16 of the Tao Te Ching, it's a very short little book, it's only about 30 pages. Go to page 16, he talks about how, you know, when we realize where we've come from, we realize that we are more than just what we are. We become at peace. We become free, essentially. But whereas when we think that we're just the name, as he calls it, the particular, as you and me and everything else out there at first, then there's all this strife that's going on and all this confusion. Very beautiful passage. You might want to read it. I'll just have to read this then because I've lost my notes here. When we realize that we're more than our identity, but we can use the identity, more than our humanity, but we can live through our humanity, that our only reality is the unknowable sense that we know through living, but we can never particularize, because in nature we are infinite. With this perspective, we become like the wind, which there's almost none of today, ungovernable and free to express by our very nature as champions of aliveness. Now, if you're interested in getting one of these documents, which was for me was amazing because it was a look at the life and humanity of not only myself and my mother and my father, and feeling that connection that they did for me. They did this for me, gave me a name. If you do decide to go down that route, I'd recommend just be aware of what the officials have to say to you when you want this. Have a good look at it. I spent several hours, or maybe an hour on it. I saw my mother's signature and the humanity in her writing. I saw the gap between the birth date and the registration date. And I got a sense of the humanity and the humanness in that experience. Mom made mistakes. She wrote my name wrong. She scratched it out and wrote it again. Made a mistake in the birth weight, scribbled that out, wrote something else. It's harder to read it. To me, all such experiences of humanness bring forth this seemingly undefinable, infinite quality of the nature of what it means to be a human being in the championship of being alive. I'll talk to you in a little bit. Thank you for listening, and you enjoy this glorious day as well. Oh, just by the way here, no, I'll screw up the image if I scan this video. Talk to you later, eh? Bye.